Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. We've been hearing a lot lately about the FBI and the CIA and the entirety of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. Most of the news hasn't been good. Allegations of corruption at the top and abuse of power. And in almost every instance of criticism, the counterpoint has been that the men and women in the ranks deserve our thanks and admiration for what they do to uphold their oath of allegiance to the Constitution and the 350 million people in the country who rely on them for our defense against domestic and international adversaries. My guest today, Ray Holcomb, is one of the good guys. As a career FBI operative for 22 years, Ray's assignments have taken him across America, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Africa, and involved espionage, counter-narcotics, mafia takedowns, national security, special weapons and tactics, and much, much more. It's all here in his book, Endless Enemies Inside FBI Counterterrorism. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, Ray.
Hey, Rick.
Thank you for coming. Welcome to 30 Minutes here at MLTV 21. Your book was fascinating.
Thank you.
You've had a varied and I hope rewarding career. 22 years didn't seem like a very long career. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first of all, what's your impression, what's your opinion about all the rocks that are being thrown at the FBI, particularly these days, and the prospect of some select committees that will be looking into some of the shenanigans we're hearing about?
Well, I'm in contact with a retired agents society, and uniformly, I think across the board, we're all concerned. There is something going on. The focus of the Bureau seems to have switched from terrorism, particularly international terrorism, which I worked for many years. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, the Bureau seems to be very focused on domestic terrorism, and how you define domestic terrorism is probably the most disconcerting part of this issue. Special units in FBI headquarters were created to identify and track American citizens, some of them appearing at school board meetings, right, which is very troubling.
It's blatantly unconstitutional, isn't it?
It's blatantly unconstitutional. They are the Mar-a-Lago search is disconcerting in that it's never happened to a president, a former president in the history of our country. Right. Secondly, it's been quiet as crickets since the search warrant was executed, which is extremely disconcerting too. Mm-hmm. There are some. Let me say this: the men and women in the field have always been apolitical, and we have always been cautioned, and we all took an oath to keep politics out of the job. Mm-hmm. But there has always been a problem, I think, and a lot of agents will agree with me, with the people sitting in headquarters. There's a lot of rubbing shoulders with politicians and legislators. Mm-hmm. that goes on down there day in and day out, and I spent some time in headquarters. So I think if there is an issue or a problem, and we've seen some FBI agents recently forced to resign. Mm-hmm. Because of foolish things they've posted on social media, things they've stated in interviews. That's very troubling. And if I could back up one more time, when I attended the FBI Academy in the early 80s, the Constitution, we all took an oath to the Constitution of the United States, and the criminal law course that we were given, I thought, was every bit as good as the criminal law course that I took in law school. It was top-notch. Stressed the Constitution and the rights and privileges of U.S. citizens, what you could not do in regard to investigating a U.S. citizen. Literally, the fear of God was put in us to respect and abide by the Constitution.
Then why is there a faction that has gone rogue?
It may well be. Andrew McCabe, number 2 in the FBI, he was, I served with him in the New York Field Division. He was on the SWAT team that I was in charge of. I knew Andrew McCabe as a very young agent. Nothing of note that I recall. He did his job. He was generally quiet. I was transferred to headquarters, and literally a couple of years later, Andrew McCabe was number 2 in the FBI. I have no idea how that occurred. No idea. There is obviously something happening down there, and most agents my age would agree. We're troubled by it.
If the Republicans get their act together in the House and they do what they say they're going to do, committees, select committees, and so on, in your opinion, given the way everything works in Washington, is it conceivable that there could be indictments? Is it conceivable that some of the big names we hear about in the news
It's conceivable.
could end up in jail?
If it was 20 years ago, there would be indictments. The abuse of FISA,
If it were 4 years.
20 years ago, there would be indictments. The FISA court, I did work with the FISA court on several occasions. You swear an affidavit to the truth of your case, and then the FISA court, if it authorizes an intercept of U.S. citizen conversations based upon your sworn affidavit, and it turns out later on that the information you swore to was knowingly false, we would have gone to jail.
But
I don't know.
That was then.
That
and
was
this
then.
is now?
This is now. I have no idea where it'll end up, but it should be investigated. And if a crime occurred, and there's strong indications it did, then people should be punished.
Yeah. What's your opinion of what's being released from Twitter, the Twitter disclosures?
I'm not surprised.
No.
Toward the end of my retirement, after I retired, I worked for a time as a consultant at the National Counterterrorism Center. Many of my colleagues, a number of my colleagues, both FBI and other agencies, were being hired by the big social media companies, Google, Twitter, Facebook. And I can remember thinking, what is their role? What is their job with these companies?
Yeah.
And initially, I just assumed it was to protect these companies against insider threat, to protect these companies against cyber intrusion, cyber hacking. At the time, it never occurred to me that one of their jobs would be to decide what was truth and what was false information.
Yeah.
Their job to decide false information from truth information.
This notion of misinformation, I mean, I never heard the word until just a few years ago. Well, that's not entirely true. As a consultant, one of my specialties was organizational communication.
Right.
And yes, we did talk about misinformation or disinformation.
Right.
But it was not as pervasive. The notion of misinformation was not as pervasive. And now everybody seems to be guilty of misinformation, which means if you have an opinion and it doesn't comply with the people who make the rules, you're now in big trouble.
Right.
Oh,
I think that...
How did that sneak into our culture?
I think it arrived hand in hand with the advent of social media. Social media is a weapon. It's been weaponized. It can be used to stifle information. It can be used to spread false information. It's a propaganda tool.
Yeah.
And our enemies, our international enemies, realized this a long time ago. I know that after the Russian Revolution, one of the first things the NKVD or subsequently the KGB did was to create a directorate, I think that it was Directorate D, of disinformation. And their main goal was to spread propaganda worldwide, undermining their adversaries and aggrandizing the communist way of life. So our enemies have been using this for decades and decades.
But Ray, in the last election, and even now, with the election in 2024, you hear it's out in the open that the Russians are engaged in a campaign already,
actively, yeah.
And that China is engaged in we know it, we talk about it, it's reported. Why can't we put a stop to it? Why do we permit them to do this to us?
Well, I don't think. Excuse me. You've seen recently that TikTok, a number of states have recently
that drives
enacted.
me crazy.
A number of states have enacted legislation to ban TikTok. Now, I don't know how you ban TikTok because it comes over the internet. Without a federal effort, and even then to stop it.
But hasn't it just been banned in the UK?
I believe it has.
Yes.
I believe it has, but
I couldn't get over that because I remember when it was introduced and everybody was talking TikTok.
Right.
At the time, we knew where it was coming from, who was sponsoring it, who was paying for it, and we knew it was being talked about. They were collecting data on our kids, and we let it happen again.
Yes, we did.
Under Trump.
Under Trump, and under the current administration. I can't say why it hasn't been done. I have my thoughts on that. I think our legislators aren't doing their job. It's that simple.
Do the Chinese have that strong a lobby in Washington?
Yeah. Absolutely.
They do.
Absolutely. Their worldwide effort to buy people is incredible. I was thinking about this today. Every single week, because I do have a security company and I do have a FBI and security background.
Do you still have security clearance?
Up until recently, yes. Oh. Every single week I receive, and I'm only on one site, I'm only on one social media site. Every week I receive 2 to 3 texts or emails from someone, Asian, very attractive young lady, and typically it's an inquiry as to would you like, is your company in need of investment? Is your company looking for financing? I get 2 or 3 of these a week. And they're always out of Southeast Asia, and it's always a picture of a very attractive young lady. If that's happening to me, I can only imagine what happens to a legislator, a federal legislator, or a legislator in a Midwest state where they're buying up thousands of acres of farmland.
And why are we allowing that? Aren't there laws against that?
I believe there are laws against that,
so.
but we need prosecutors and the Attorney General's office that's going to pursue it. Law enforcement, and this goes for the FBI as well, we could not investigate a case unless we had the approval of the prosecutor, whether it was whatever district your case was in. Because to waste time and energy on investigating what you suspect is a crime, only to have the prosecutor say, I won't take this to court.
Yeah.
It's a total waste of time. So If you don't have the backing of the Attorney General's office,
No.
you're not going to go anywhere.
During your 23-year career, you were involved in a number of firsts. I could tick them off, but you can tell us about them. Was that circumstance? Was that have others had similar careers where they have been given opportunities to be in the forefront of some of the initiatives?
It's probably a bit of both. I often joke about being, Forrest Gump and ending up in certain key positions. For instance, and part of that reason is that I was always ready to volunteer. I was one of those agents who, if the director or the agent in charge of my office said I need somebody to go to Tanzania to interview a terrorist, I'd raise my hand because I truly loved the work. I was very dedicated, very passionate about the work, patriotic. I loved my country, particularly after 9/11. We were attacked by an international enemy, and like so many Americans, I wanted to get into the fight. Yeah. So anything they asked me to do, to the detriment, I should say this, to the detriment of my family and personal relationships, and in that regard, it was probably a bit selfish on my part, because my wife and my children suffered. I was out of the country many, many times, and often they wouldn't know where I was or what my status was. So in that regard, it was selfish. But I volunteered almost every time I was asked to take a foreign mission. I agreed to do it.
You mentioned 9/11. How did that happen? How did that sneak through our intelligence system? Everybody said at the time it was such a failure of our intelligence system.
It was a failure of our intelligence system, and as the 9/11 Commission report states.
But why?
It was a failure of communication among several organizations. The FBI, the CIA, NSA, and probably some other agencies. But it was a failure. It was a failure to talk to each other. And part of the problem has always been it's a territorial war.
The silos.
Yes, silos. It's always been that way.
No, you just said territorial war. What are they fighting over?
Influence, budget, resources, headlines. Yeah. It can be that simple. There was very little give and take or conversation prior to 9/11 between those organizations.
Was the creation of Homeland Security, which was supposed to fix that, was that just a sop to people at the time who were crying because we had been so inept?
I think you're right. I think it was just a way of telling the American public we're fixing this broken system. I don't think it fixed anything.
No.
And it's typical government reaction to any problem. Let's just throw $1 billion at it. Yep. Let's create some new kind of organization. Let's create a number more agencies doing the same job and in conflict with each other. No, I think the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was a mistake. I think we had FEMA. We could have improved FEMA. We could have improved. If I had been in charge, I would have made the directors of the CIA, NSA, the FBI all sit down at the weekly cabinet meeting and work together and talk together, and I would have made sure that they were working together.
No.
I don't think we needed DHS.
You say in the book, you make a number of points in the book, but one of them that struck me was that today's agents are kinder and gentler as a result of the training they do or don't get, and that you don't think that is acceptable to today's public if they were aware of it, because they are. This is my word, not yours. when they get in the field, they lack resilience, they lack resourcefulness, all the things that you and others went through, a very tough experience to prove yourself, first to yourself and then to your superiors.
Yes. I stand by that. I think that when I joined the FBI, most of the senior agents were war veterans. I mean, they were either Vietnam War veterans. There were even a few that had fought in the Korean War. Many of them were former military. A lot of them were former state or local police officers. We had many agents who had been in special operations with the military. And yes, we had accountants, and yes, we had lawyers. I was a lawyer because we needed that talent. We need that skill set. If you're going to go after white-collar criminals, you better know how to read a ledger. And you better know the law. But they were a tougher, older bunch. I think today it's a generational thing. I think across the board, not only in the FBI, but in every agency, you'll find this issue. There are a lot of veterans that have come home from Afghanistan and Iraq who've experienced hardship, understand command and control, obeying orders, the Constitution, and the allegiance to the Constitution. But even that number is dwindling as we move into this next decade.
A problem that's exasperated by wokeism, CRT, and all of the other things that are being done, all levels and aspects of government, but most importantly to the military.
Most importantly.
I mean, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, all of our adversaries must be jumping up and down because we're doing it to ourselves.
I ask this simple question all the time of people who bring this up. Who benefits from our military being forced to take courses on critical race theory? Who benefits from Americans being divided, divisive, angry with each other, blaming our country and our society for all of the wrongs that took place hundreds of years ago? Who benefits from that in the world? Who benefits from that? Do you think that these same courses are being taught in Russia or in Iran or in China?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
No. So, how do we fix it?
How do we fix it? Wow.
You don't have time to tell me.
That's the question. Well, we need to have another election. How do we, if I could say this, Rick, parents have to be more involved. Grandparents have to be more involved. We have to look at where our children are going to school. We have to look at what our schools are teaching our children, and we have to be engaged. We have to be engaged in raising our children again. Again. We've drifted away. We've turned that responsibility over to daycare centers, to educators. We've walked away from that responsibility, which in my mind is one of the greatest responsibilities any parent has.
But the book of How to Defeat Us was written long ago.
Long ago.
Right? And we're just going chapter by chapter.
It's there. I studied the KGB manual. When I was in the FBI, we were able to obtain a copy from a defector, and word for word, what's been taking place in the last 20 years is taking place right now.
Yes.
It's clear as it could be.
Yeah. Well, if there were a young man or woman who has aspirations of becoming an FBI agent, what advice would you give to that person? Let's assume that it's a young person coming out of college, has no military experience, none of the other people you described.
Right.
But just as you, at your time, knew that you wanted to serve the government, the country, and wanted to be an FBI agent.
Right. Well, I would tell them to make sure they understand what the nature of the job is. I would tell them that they need to understand and revisit American history, the good and the bad. They need to understand how we as a nation have sacrificed to preserve and save democracy for hundreds of years, how over 1 million American men have died saving the world from totalitarianism, fascism. America has done more than its share to preserve democracy in the world, and young people need to understand that. I understand we have to recognize that there have been failures in our society and wrongs in our society. I have two great uncles who fought for, three actually, who fought for the Union in the Civil War. All three died. I know where they're buried. I have their letters. They gave up their lives to end slavery, as did over literally, I think, 400,000 other young Northern boys and men. So we sacrificed dearly to start righting that wrong. America has been the light of the world. We've stood up to horrible governments and throughout our history, and they need to understand that. Any recruit needs to understand
But
that.
who's going to teach them that? Certainly not the colleges, and not the school system, the public school system.
That is, again, it falls back on the parents.
Regrettably, not even many of the private schools. They've all been infected.
They've all been turned, so to speak. So it's on the parents. It's on our generation. It's on our generation to impart that to our children, to decide where they're going to go to school, to go.
Now, you've seen in other cultures, maybe even in this country, that it doesn't take an army to necessarily turn a country. A revolution started with, a handful of people, of men for the most part.
Right.
And then spread.
Right.
We have in this country now, and I know a handful of them, people who were picking up the mantle of, conservatism. That's not even the right word. But there is a right and a wrong, and there are standards we should all be living by, and codes and so on.
Right.
And they're making a difference around the country.
Right.
Particularly at the school level. As you know, the last election, we saw evidence of some of the grassroots groups that are coming up and making demands of their school boards and so on. And if they don't comply, they get thrown out. Do you think there's some hope that it's going to bubble up?
I think so.
You think so?
I think that some of the young parents that I know, once they realize how important the future is for their children, and how important it is that their education is right and monitored, I think the parents of this generation. What was that famous saying that Churchill had a famous saying about youth? We have nothing to fear but... No, it was anyone who's not... Roosevelt. Yeah. Churchill said, anyone who's not a liberal by the age of 25 has no heart. Anyone who's... And I'm paraphrasing. Yes. Anyone who's still liberal after the age of 30 has no brains. And he was a wise man. He was a wise man. He was a wise man. How are you occupying your time now? I mean, you've had such an active life. You certainly didn't retire. No, I don't think I'll ever retire. After I left the FBI, I had to retire because I reached retirement age. I went to work as a consultant for the National Counterterrorism Center. I also did some overseas training as a contractor for one of the agencies. And then I worked as the Homeland Security Advisor for the state of Delaware for 4 years. Now I am the managing director of a security company known as First Watch Global. And we provide security consulting services, broad spectrum, soup to nuts. And I have a network of retired agents, law enforcement officers, intelligence officers, and some military special operations people across the nation that I can call upon if there's a need. So I'm hoping to take those 40-some years and impart some of what I learned to the private sector.
Is there another book in the offing? Or is this one and done?
I think that could be it. No, yes. The fact of the matter is I am working on a second book, and it's about the Civil War, and I'm using all the research and
I'll
letters.
talk to you about that.
Yeah, I will.
My guest today has been Ray Holcomb, who had a fascinating career in the FBI. His book is Endless Enemies. So until next time, I'm Rick Anthony. This is 30 Minutes. Take very good care of yourselves.